Hey everyone, today we are talking all things primary writing. Specifically, I plan to share 3 top tips to help your struggling writers in kindergarten, 1st, and 2nd grade. If you are a K-2 teacher, then you already know how difficult it is to teach writing to our youngest learners. Those kindergarten, 1st, and 2nd grade students have so much to learn in terms of their literacy development to be able to sit down and write a personal narrative or an opinion story. But don't you worry, I am here to help with that. I have spent the last 5 or 6 years just really honing in on primary writing. I love teaching writing. I love researching best practices in writing. In fact, I love it so much that I have my own SJT writing club where hundreds of teachers join me every single month, where I share research-based lessons, activities, ideas for getting your youngest students to produce their best writing. In case you are new here, my name is Susan Jones, so let me go ahead and grab those tips and ideas for your struggling readers. And while I do that, be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel. That way you can see all of my teaching videos. Let's get started. All right, tip number 1 to help your struggling writers is to focus on the illustrations. Now, there's a few different ways you can go about doing this, but when I am always talking to my kindergarten, 1st, and 2nd grade teachers, I like to remind them that, especially those kindergarten teachers, the standards literally say using a combination of illustrations, or I think they say drawing, dictation, and writing. So remember that our illustrations are the story. The illustrations are such an important part of our youngest students' storytelling, especially in those kindergarten and beginning 1st grade years where they are just learning to take their ideas and all they know about literacy and form their thoughts on paper. Now, there's a couple different ways I like to use those illustrations to get the most out of my writers, specifically my struggling writers. And first, I like to use a sheet like this one. It is called Say and Sketch. Now, I've used this for years and I've talked about this quite a few times, but using a sheet like this one really lets your students formulate their ideas in their head first, say it out loud to a partner, even if they just say it out loud themselves, and then sketch each part of their story in order. After students go ahead and fill out this say and sketch sheet, I have them read it back not only to themselves, but to a partner as well. As they're able to read back this story, they can add more to the illustration that they already have there. One of the reasons I like to use a sheet like this one is because it really lets your students get their ideas out of their head and onto paper. Now, after they go ahead and complete all 3 parts of this, I will have them read their illustrations, read their story aloud to a classmate. And as they're kind of reading each step, if I'm listening in, I have them think about what they can still add to their sketch that they may have said aloud. Usually they'll sketch something down, and then as they're kind of telling the story and what's happening in that illustration, they actually share more details that I have them go back into their sketch and add. The reason we do this is because your students realistically have so much to share. Just think about your young authors when they show up on Monday morning and want to tell you all about their weekend. There's a lot up there and they just don't have the tools yet to share it in a story format. Now, once we've gotten our ideas on that say and sketch sheet, this is where we can take those illustrations and actually start to formulate sentences. For each of those picture boxes, I like to grab a completely blank piece of paper, and this is where we start to actually write our story. To do that, I basically have them read that illustration out loud one at a time. So first, they read that first illustration, then they will go ahead and write it down on one piece of paper. We do it frame by frame for all 3 of those boxes. Now, if your students are not writing words yet, then I would actually have you go back and watch my sentence writing video. It looks like this one, and that shares some tips about how I would get students actually writing sentences and learning how to put those words onto paper first. But even if your students are kind of in that emergent writing category where maybe they are only writing down the first letter of each word, that's totally fine, and you can still use this strategy with them. So they would say their sentence out loud, write it down to the best of their ability on each piece of paper. Now, that's already going to be a lot of work for some of your struggling students to go ahead and do that 3 times for each of those boxes. So then the next day I would have them go back to that illustration, the same exact one, because again, you had them add even more details to their illustrations first, and then they might be able to share another thing that was happening that maybe they sketched and didn't write that first day. Using illustrations like this is going to get your students' mind flowing and going to give them the ideas that they can then take and write on paper. Now, also when using illustrations, when we add details to our writing, we want our struggling writers to focus on those illustrations as well. We don't necessarily need them to write every single detail in Word format on their paper. Instead, they can add some of those details to their illustrations. And that's something I'm going to talk about in this next tip. All right, tip number 2 for helping your struggling writers is to add fun details to your stories. And remember, you can do this with words or in their illustrations. Now, what do I mean by fun details? These are the lessons that after we've kind of taught what a personal narrative is, how we use transition words, and students maybe have a beginning, middle, and an ending, then we like to talk about different authors' crafts. And we like to look at mentor texts. They like to watch me go ahead and model adding some of these fun details. Different details that I love to add to students' writing include onomatopoeia or sound words, and I like to use Jonathan London's Froggy books as a mentor text for this. To do this, we will basically talk about what those sound words are, what they mean. We might make a little anchor chart that looks like this one, and then we will go ahead and put on our little glasses here, and we will search for onomatopoeia or examples of sound words in our stories. So like I said, if I use Jonathan London's Froggy books, we will flip through and we will see if we can kind of spy some of those sound words within his texts. We will see how he used them. He uses them a lot as like kind of big words added to the illustration. Sometimes he has them within the actual text. So we will look at both of those, and then we will practice as authors going back to our own stories and seeing where we can add any sound words. Now I'll say it again, those sound words don't need to just be added to the text. Your struggling writers might just add them to their actual illustration in the way that Jonathan London did. In fact, this should be encouraged because those students are now adding more information for their reader to kind of pick up. They're still adding more to their story, even if they didn't write down any new sentences. Some other fun details I like to have students include in their stories include caption action bubbles that look like this. Now, these are just a fun and interactive way to have students add captions to their stories or to their informative text after, of course, we've learned what a caption is. But I like this one because students actually go ahead and they will cut out a little caption action bubble, paste it to their story, and again, it's like a little interactive way to add more details to their story. Lastly, I've already shared about this a few times, but I love having students add sensory details to their writing, and I have an anchor chart that looks like this one. I will link that down below in the description of this video, but that's just a great way to have students add details to both the illustration and the writing. I give this example a lot, but an example for that one would be if students could put themselves back into their story and ask themselves, what could I feel during that time, right? Using the sensory of touch. They would think, okay, I could feel the wind, going against my face. Now they could add that to their story in two different ways. They could go ahead and draw some swirly wind lines into their illustration, which would tell the reader, oh, it was a windy day. Or they could also say that sentence I said earlier, I could feel the wind on my face. And they might want to go ahead and write it right in their story. All right, tip 3. Coming at ya. All right, tip number 3 to help out your struggling writers in grades K through 2 is to celebrate their writing. Now, this might sound obvious, but the more we celebrate our students' writing and let them know that all their efforts are completely worth it, that their ideas are valued, whether they are writing, novels down on paper or whether they are just doing excellent illustrations and they're able to dictate to you what's happening in their story, all of our students' writing is worthy. Now, for how we can go ahead and do this, I do this in a few different ways. First, I talk to my parents a lot about inventive spelling. Here's an inventive spelling letter that I send home at the beginning of every single year, letting my parents know, the parents of my students, letting them know what inventive spelling is, why we will be using it and praising it throughout the year, and also just giving them those tools and understanding to praise their own students' writing as well. So getting parents on board is important. Another way I like to celebrate student writing is at the end of every single writing lesson. I use the writing workshop method, so we will generally meet on the carpet. I will do a mini lesson. I will show them either using a mentor text or my own writing how to go ahead and do something, whatever the mini lesson was, and then students go back and do it themselves. At the end of every single lesson, we have a quick little wrap up where I tend to point out different students and what they added to their stories that day. Now, when I do that very purposefully. I do not always share my best students' writing, and I will often share it as an exemplary text and what our writing can look like because it gives other students ideas. But it can also sometimes defeat those struggling writers. So I also like to very much point out what students are doing in their process. And by process, I mean their writing process. So as I gave in examples previously, if I see a student go ahead and add those swirly wind lines to their illustration, even if they didn't write anything on their paper, that is a student I am going to praise, I am going to highlight their work in front of the class, and I'm going to not only make them feel really good about themselves, but I'm also going to recognize that that was an important step and that also was a great job adding to our writing. So as you go ahead and kind of point out the things students are doing each day to give examples to the rest of your class, be sure you pick students of varying writing levels and where they're at in different parts of their writing process to highlight. Lastly, for celebration is an author's chair. And now author's chair has been around forever, but basically at the end of a writing unit, or sometimes even in the middle of one, you can have students come up and read either their whole story, but usually I like to pick like a page or two, and they will get up there and they will proudly read their story. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but they can also just read their illustration and tell the class what's going on in their story. When you're doing an author's chair, you want to be sure that the students listening are giving their best attention, and I also like to give them kind of feedback points and talking points that they can share with the author. They can either give a compliment based on something specific they see, or they can ask a question about their story. All right, everyone, so there you have 3 easy tips to help your struggling writers in kindergarten, 1st, and 2nd grade. Just as a quick recap, you want to focus on their illustrations. Remember, illustrations are the story. There are wordless books for a reason, and in reading, we teach that those wordless books still can entertain us and tell a story. Remember that when you're teaching writing. Tip number 2 is to add those fun details into our writing. It makes it exciting for your students and they see different ways that they can go ahead and add more to their stories, even if they can't write down sentences just yet. And tip number 3 is to celebrate, celebrate, celebrate. Celebrate your students no matter where they are at in their writing progress and kind of meet them where they're at. Let them know that their progress they're making is fantastic, because it is. I'll go ahead and link a few of the worksheets and anchor charts I mentioned in this video down in the description below, and I'll also link the SJT Writing Club in case you are interested in that. That again is a monthly membership where we go over different research-based writing strategies and lesson plans to get your K-2 students writing confidently. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please go ahead and give it a thumbs up so I know, and make sure you are subscribed to my channel and click that bell. That way you're notified of every new week's video. See you next time. Bye.